Okay, hello, welcome everyone to the first of a pair of webcasts being presented this week and next week by the New York State Department of Health, Office of Mental Health, and Institute for Disaster Mental Health. I'm Carla Vermeulen, the Deputy Director of IDMH at SUNY New Paltz. So these two events are follow-ups to the webcast we hosted with the same really excellent presenters in late 2020 and early to mid 2021. So we are very fortunate to have a repeat performance by Rachel Call and Kayla Seavey from the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Ms. Call is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's the behavioral health lead for the agency. She has an extensive background in providing guidance and direction to the behavioral health, public health, and emergency response communities throughout the country on ways to enhance and integrate behavioral health services into preparedness, response, and recovery efforts to foster individual, community, and responder resilience. And her colleague, Ms. Seavey, is a behavioral health program analyst for the agency, where she supports behavioral health preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. Her background is in social work, and she has extensive experience in international community development and public health. So both Ms. Call and Ms. Seavey have been totally immersed in the pandemic response from the very beginning, and they've used that experience to really think very deeply and, in my view, very creatively about how to support responders throughout this really difficult time. So their earlier presentations were full of valuable and genuinely practical advice. If you missed them, we encourage you to find them on the Learning Management System or the IDMH's YouTube channel. Today's follow-up, which is called How Are You Now? Exploring Emerging Stressors and Evolving Approaches to Coping, is going to explore our current state of functioning when everyone in the field really is still living in this constantly shifting environment of some optimism, some ongoing concern, and for many, a really very real state of depletion, I would say, from coping with all of the demands of the past 2.5 years. So today's topic is really focused on sort of individual functioning and wellness. That's going to be complemented by next week's webcast, same day, same time, different link, but also Thursday at 1 o'clock. That one will be titled Building an Organizational Culture of Resilience, Lessons from the Field. And that is going to focus on how leadership teams and organizational systems can really build that culture of resistance in their organizations or agencies. So I am super excited to hear how their perspectives on the pandemic have evolved at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Call and Kayla Seavey. Thanks.
Thank you, Carla. We appreciate that very thorough and effective intro. I'm Rachel, and I'm going to let Kayla say hello real quick.
Hi, happy to be here.
All right, also just making sure our audio is working. So as Carla said, we've been engaged in really looking at the workforce issues or stressors that have been impacting workforce over the last 2.5 years. In our work as disaster kind of response and preparedness people, we've always looked at responders as a key component of that. But the pandemic really changed that term responders to kind of just about everybody. So many people, so many sectors were impacted directly and had to think about how to cope in much more practical strategies. So we're going to give you a little bit of just a reminder of what we talked about last time. But right now, what we wanted to present is sort of what we're hearing now from folks across sectors, across public health, emergency response, healthcare, behavioral health, et cetera, kind of what we've been hearing and what people are sort of really looking at now, now that we're 2.5 years into trying to manage this. Couple just housekeeping things to start. First of all, if you haven't already, grab a piece of paper and a pencil. We're going to have a couple of opportunities during this presentation for you to kind of put pen to paper. You won't have to share it, but we do know that it facilitates kind of holding on to information and really kind of making it specific to yourself. We're going to be using the chat box quite a bit to communicate with you. We like to ask questions and have our participants actually put stuff into the chat so that we can kind of get a sense of what you're thinking or what you'd want to contribute to the presentation. So please, please, please do participate in the chat when we ask you to. You will notice you'll be on mute, but the chat box should give you ample opportunity to engage. We're going to go off camera while we're presenting, and we'll go back on for Q&A at the end, and there will be some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, and I suggest you hold on to it till the end, as we're monitoring chat for reactions, responses, but we may not be fully monitoring it for questions at that time, but we will have time for questions. You'll notice within the slides that there will be some live links to other resources and material that we want to make sure you have access to. You will be getting a copy of the slides after this so that you will have access to all other content as well as some additional material. And after that, I think that is all of my housekeeping. So I'm going to go ahead and go off camera. And next slide, Kayla. And just really quickly, a disclaimer that these are views and impressions that we have gathered. Kayla and myself don't necessarily represent the views of the Department of Health and Human Services or the U.S. government. Though everything that we do present, I can promise, is evidence-based and evidence-informed. We're pretty careful about that. And now I'm going to let Kayla kind of ask a couple questions so that we can kind of see who's in the audience here. Kayla?
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, we want to hear from you. So if you haven't opened the chat box already, please open it. And I'm going to ask that you put in 2 pieces of information. First, where do you work, or what is your workforce sector? So are you in public health? Are you in emergency management, healthcare, behavioral health? Where is your workspace? Like what sector? And then the second piece is, what does that look like? Are you virtual, or are you in person, maybe a hybrid? So I'm going to give a moment, and if you can put in those 2 pieces of information, where you work and whether you're hybrid, virtual, in person, maybe a blend of all of the above. Okay, so I'm seeing a mix. I'm seeing some health departments, some emergency management, a lot of hybrid as well as in-person, fully remote. This is a really nice mix. Rachel, I'm seeing a lot of information and engagement in the chat. Are there pieces that I'm missing here?
No, it's good. We've got, it's very interesting to see, just for everybody's benefit, just how many different people are here with their own experiences. There's certainly a lot of behavioral health folks, but also emergency managers, first responders, healthcare, as well as sort of working for state or federal government. And it looks like we have a fair number of people that are back to in person, even more that are kind of hybrid, and a few that are still virtual. So that's good for us to know as we kind of think about these strategies and how you might want to tailor them or think about them given the evolving work environment that we all find ourselves in. Thanks for doing that, Kayla.
Yeah. And thank you all for your engagement in the chat. It's nice to see so many responses. So we did want to give just a really quick recap of our previous presentation. As Carla and Rachel mentioned, this is a follow-up. So over a year ago, we really were framing our content through a check engine metaphor. So with wellness and individual resilience, when I think of a check engine light, when it comes on, that's an indication we need to do something. But what we were hearing at the time was that with the stressors and level of engagement, this check engine light was often being pushed back or postponed. So we really highlighted some just-in-time strategies and resources. And we've embedded those here. So if you're interested in learning more, these are all embedded, and you can look through these after this presentation and after this webinar.
So we're going to ask just a couple, just to sort of get a sense of what your perception is of how just folks are doing in general. It doesn't have to be personal. It can just be kind of your perception of how are folks doing. So we're going to have 2 statements, and I'm going to ask you to put in the chat between an A to an E, whether you strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. Our first statement being, The stream of crisis events facing the world right now is overwhelming for most people. Is that something people agree with? Not really. They feel kind of neutral about it. And I'm seeing many agree and strongly agrees. It does just feel like every time you turn on the news or pick up the paper or have a conversation with someone, there's just, it's not just national, it's a very tense time globally with many challenges facing people all over the world. And it's very hard to sort of take a step back and get away from it. You can sort of say, hey, I'm not going to watch the news tonight, but it doesn't matter. This is just so prevalent right now. So that's statement one. Let's go ahead to statement two, Kayla. What about this one? The number of people experiencing suicidal ideation has increased significantly over the past year. What's your perception of that? Does it seem like this very significant and distressing stress disorder and mental health disorder is more prevalent than it's been? Is that a concern you're hearing from people or yourself? And I'm seeing a lot of agrees. A few people were kind of in a neutral zone, which is great. That's fine too. All right. But most people are saying, yeah, I agree. I think this is a bigger problem. And some people just may sort of feel like, hey, this has always been an issue, or maybe in wherever your experience is, you're not seeing this as an increasing concern, which is just fine. I'm going to show you, and I just want to comment that, yeah, the fact that the number of mental health providers or even medical providers has been on the decline, actually, is also contributing perhaps to kind of the access to care, which may absolutely impact how significant and serious things like depression and anxiety evolve. Let's go to the next slide, Kayla. So just to give you the data on it, basically, and these are a few of the polls we pulled up. And again, these are live links, so you can read it yourself. But first of all, what I find significant is the American Psychological Association's polling is saying that just a vast majority of adults they polled are saying that they feel, as you've said, that this constant stream of crises has been extremely difficult to manage emotionally and even psychologically and probably intellectually. And 73% are saying they're overwhelmed. So we've gone from a place of being sort of stressed and fatigued and feeling all of this anxiousness around the pandemic to feeling kind of maybe just overwhelmed or flooded. So it's kind of a different space that people are in. Another article from Frontiers that has seen increased diagnoses of stress and mental health disorders, particularly around healthcare workers, but not just healthcare workers. Any of the sectors that have been adversely or inequitably exposed to managing the pandemic are experiencing, or at least reporting experiencing, these kinds of conditions. And then Mental Health America had really pointed out that they are seeing a pretty significant increase in adults who are willing to report and who have reported serious thoughts of suicide. And I can also say from working with our colleagues in the childcare and the disaster mental health for children sector, they are also seeing more examples of young people, particularly teenagers and younger, coming into the ER for suicidal ideation. And so that is a huge concern right now. So again, I think we're still looking at less than 5% of adults are reporting this. I think that's an underreport, but we are definitely seeing that the reporting is going up, not down, and that is certainly something we want to pay attention to. So the hope is that we can together and individually kind of think in terms of how to cope in this reality that we're in right now, in a way that can help us thrive and survive. Next slide.
And when we're thinking about stress and framing stress, this is an individual assessment tool we've been using to gauge how stress is impacting your life performance, whether it's positively or negatively. And this may look familiar to you, but essentially we're looking at this as, how are you showing up now? And we used to frame this tool previously through kind of professional performance, and we've shifted that here to life performance, where people really are right now and recognizing signs and symptoms that indicate that stress is beginning to negatively impact performance, whether that's in the personal or professional space. With that in mind, I'm curious, how do you know that you're edging into that injured space? What are your signs or symptoms of stress? I'm going to ask that you put that into the chat box. I was, as an example, I was chatting with my sister earlier today about this, and for her, her symptoms show up personally before they show up professionally, and it's usually through laundry. So when her laundry is piling up, that's kind of her sign, that's her indication that she's edging into that injured stage. So I'm seeing irritability, some of those kind of interpersonal pieces, sleep being impacted. It can really be a wide range of symptoms and red flags that kind of show, okay, I'm edging into that injured stage. And I'm seeing that a lot of these, they aren't really tied specifically to one domain, whether it's professional or personal, they can kind of impact life performance as kind of its own overall category. I don't play guitar. Yep. Feeling disconnected and cookie dough. I can relate to that. Rachel, is there anything I missed here? There's a lot of answers.
I think it's interesting because when we look at this as a performance continuum and we're thinking work, I like the idea of it, like, how are you showing up to your life, the way you framed it, Kayla, because it's sort of like, we all need some stress in our lives to sort of feel motivated and excited and ready to like do something challenging and fun. But yeah, it's sort of that if stress is really not being addressed or even not confronted, then we start seeing maybe not even some of these things people are saying, like, I can't focus, my sleep is disrupted, the irritability, but also I also like the examples of the stuff you're not doing, right? I'm not doing the stuff I love. I'm not doing the stuff that gives me that passion and that motivation. And to really take a minute and reflect, like, hey, when in the last couple of weeks did I do X, whatever the X is that makes you kind of joyful or engaged? So those kinds of things, understanding that ill and injured stage, injured ill stage, so that you can really kind of think about, all right, how do I want to show up? When am I in that really yellow zone and things are feeling good? So playing my guitar, I'm baking those chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream, baking those chocolate chip cookies instead of eating the dough. No, I'm a fan of the dough too. So I think that's just made me reflect on that, Kayla. Appreciate it.
No, this is a phenomenal just spread of reflections in the chat. And yeah, it really is about how do you recognize when you're in that injured stage, because the closer we get to that ill stage, the harder it is to move back up. So I think you all covered all of these of how stressors can show up. These are just kind of general examples that we've been hearing a lot from our various stakeholders. And these have all been noted in the chat box of whether it's physical signs of aches and pains, as well as kind of that cognitive space of irritability, and impacts on productivity, whether that's professional or personal. But I do want to reflect here that, so we have these stressors that can show up. But what happens when they're left unaddressed? And this really increases risk factors for adverse stress conditions, really turning into long-term conditions or diagnoses. And this is something that we're hearing more about and having more conversations and discussions about. And this is something that, like we saw previously in the data slide, that there's more information coming up about this. Rachel, is there anything I'm missing here?
No, this is, I think this is the concern now is some of the stress conditions we've been hearing about in the past were really in that anxiety realm, some in the grief realm, but now I think the other thing we're starting to see are stress conditions that will result in physiological issues as well. And that is very important to pay attention to kind of, and people in the chat had said, they notice a lack of self-care, even things like hygiene, energy levels, these kinds of physiological signs and symptoms are important to pay attention to in addition. Thanks, Gil.
Thanks.
And so, I'm big on my metaphors, as Kayla knows. And I feel like when I talk to people, what they want is they want the world right now and they want their existence to be kind of like, here we are in smooth waters under our own motor, moving forward, making progress, heading in a direction, right? That's kind of what we all are ready for. We really just want to be getting on with things and making progress. But I think we really need to reflect on the fact that in some ways, next slide, Kayla, we're still kind of like this, right? Where, we're not a motorboat underway in smooth waters. We're still in pretty rolling seas under sail, which means that we are kind of at the will of the elements that are affecting us. And we're still trying to figure out, how do you set a course? How do you set direction? How do you maintain agility and adaptability in this? Yeah, that roller coaster that it just feels like. You feel like we go one step forward, two steps back. I hear people talking about that a lot. But if it is the reality, how do we take control of that wind? How do we do our best to feel like we're not just kind of rudderless out there, but that we are able to set some sort of direction? And that really kind of sets us up to talk a little bit about strategy. Kayla, I'm going to turn this to you.
Thanks, Rachel. So we're going to get started with emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, it's a way of managing your emotions and understanding the emotions of others. It's a skill. It's a skill to identify, to assess, to manage the emotions of yourself, others, as well as groups. And when we kind of unpack emotional intelligence, there are different spaces, there are different domains. So there's personal and social pieces of emotional intelligence. And within the personal space, it can be broken down into self-awareness, self-management, and self-motivation. And the social space can be broken down into social awareness and social skills. And I will say there's a lot of information about emotional intelligence, and there are a lot of different ways that you can look at it and kind of categorize these buckets and areas. But this is how we are going to frame it. And we're going to focus in on that personal piece of emotional intelligence for kind of like this overarching piece for our strategies throughout the rest of this webinar, of kind of breaking down those personal pieces of self-awareness, self-management, and self-motivation. And if we look at these personal domains under the microscope a little bit more, in self-awareness, it's really that, how are you doing? How are you feeling about it? And a piece of that is really tied to motivation as well. Then we have self-management. This is the self-control, regulation, and then self-motivation, that internal drive piece. And you may be looking at these and thinking, okay, I'm really good at self-awareness, but I struggle with self-motivation, or I've been struggling with self-motivation. So these are spaces, they are skills. They're skills we can build, but they're also skills that if we don't practice them, if we don't stretch them, they're areas that we can kind of struggle with at times. So I'm actually curious in the chat, is is there a domain here, self-awareness, self-management, or self-motivation, that you feel you excel in? You can put that into the chat. And I'm actually going to ask Rachel. Rachel, when you look at emotional intelligence, is there a category here that you feel like you've got, or you feel comfortable with when you're looking at this?
When I look at it, which a lot of people in the chat are saying, self-awareness is the main one for me, because I pay a lot of attention to kind of that piece of how I show up in the world. I noticed some people talking about self-motivation and self-management. I just wanted to say, one of the things I've noticed in myself in the last year, and I think it's part of the fatigue, is that self-motivation piece, the growth versus fixed mindset. And by that meaning sort of, wanting to continue to, whether it's advance or evolve or get better, however you want to put that growth mindset versus fix. Like, this is kind of where I'm at, and this is what I do, and I'm okay here. Or I just don't feel like I've got the confidence or the energy or what I need to kind of move forward and go beyond. And I wanted to point that out as a place that has been a challenge for me lately, because I've talked to several of my colleagues about this situation where we sort of feel like there's things we want to do and there's things we want to kind of change, but we're having a very hard time finding the motivation because we're just kind of tired. I'm just tired. Like, I've been working hard. I've been working a lot. I've been trying to manage my personal stuff effectively, and I don't know where the juice is supposed to come from. So that kind of leads me in a circle back to the self-awareness. And I like that question, like, what are you doing now and how do you feel about it? And part of it is kind of identifying what's working, and then kind of where do we go next? And of course, the self-regulation and self-control is the bridge between the two for me. So that's kind of how I look at this umbrella or this frame, Kayla, and it does help me when I'm trying to figure out, okay, what action can I take next to improve the self-motivation piece that I'm concerned about? How do I use my self-awareness, leverage self-management in order to kind of work into that self-motivation? So I don't know, as you were looking at the chat or what you were reflecting on, Kayla, but did you have further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like, especially and we're going to move into kind of concrete strategies in a bit, but oftentimes these really do overlap when we're thinking about even what we already do. So there were a lot of comments on people feeling very comfortable about self-awareness. And you can really kind of connect the dots when we're thinking about this of, okay, how can we build on those domains and those pieces that we have some comfort, or we know that we have skills in, to build other aspects in other domains within this kind of personal umbrella of emotional intelligence. And we're actually going to move into that. So we're going to kind of, we've talked about these different buckets, these different spaces, but what are the actual strategies we can do for this that's a little less abstract and more kind of concrete? And for the self-awareness piece, a key strategy for this is really building self-awareness and tracking and identifying what you're doing and how you feel about it. So intentional self-tracking, of really thinking, okay, what do I already track? And kind of taking it a step further of what does that mean as a really intentional strategy. And I'm curious in the chat, if you're looking over this, and these are just some examples of how you can engage in the strategy of self-tracking for self-awareness. What do you track? Like, are there examples here that resonate, that click, or are there other things that you track on a day-to-day basis or maybe a weekly basis? Meditation.
Physical activity, sleeping. Oh, hydration. That's a good thing too. Physical activity, sleep. Yep, steps. And I'm also curious, Kayla, if I can ask this question, like if you're like, how do you track it? Like, what are you guys using? Are you guys using a calendar, a journal, a to-do list? Without condoning anybody's product, is there a product you use that you like? Bearable, mindful, yeah. Journal. I'm seeing fitness trackers, different apps and programs like Noom, the Apple Health. I can tell you that Peloton tracks things for me all the time and reminds me that I need to get on the bike if I'm going to make my goals. So a lot of people exercise, track exercise, bedtime. I like that you can use some of these devices to even help you incorporate new habits. Mindful nutrition, that's good. And I do want to say that some people may feel like, hey, I don't really track anything, and maybe you don't, but take another look at it and think it may not be the way we're thinking about tracking, right? It may not be that you sit down and say, oh, I do 10,000 steps a day, but you might be tracking something, right? Like something with your personal work calendar, or being in touch with friends and family, that kind of thing. But whatever kinds of tracking you do, you can build off that or incorporate some more in to just recognize the stuff you do that either makes you feel like you're advancing or progressing, or that just reinforces kind of how you want to feel. So we really found this sort of as the first part of self-awareness, is that tracking piece as a strategy to really consider what do you already track, or what could you track that might just help you feel like you're under a engine heading in a direction versus being buffeted around by the waves, so to speak. Kayla, what else were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just gonna add, when I look at this list, the one that really I found helpful is annual leave. So if you have annual leave, tracking that, whether it's through an Excel sheet or on a piece of paper, I find that it's kind of dual purpose. So one, it makes sure that yes, it was tracked and uploaded and updated appropriately and correctly, because sometimes technical glitches happen. But it's also a way to kind of think proactively about taking leave and taking breaks and seeing, okay, I have this much time available, or here's some upcoming activities I want to take, and kind of planning that ahead of time as a strategy. So that's one I've been using frequently and enjoying. And I do appreciate the Google Doc shared with your partner. Yes, as a way of kind of sharing information. So yeah, I'm taking notes as well. So if you haven't been taking notes, I encourage you to look through the chat as well to see if there are any ideas, whether it's on this slide or in the chat, for things that maybe you haven't thought about, or maybe you used to track, that kind of sparks interest.
I think the other thing it's helpful for, as we were talking about, is just a way of helping change behavior, right? Because I notice people talking about whether it's exercise or mood, etc. Also things like, as Kayla is going to talk about in a second, things like sleep. I know at the beginning of the year, when I was thinking about kind of what do I really want to do to kind of up my game on my self-care, and I was thinking, it's about sleep, and the correlation between sleep and health and well-being and emotional health is almost bigger than anything else. The correlation between sleep and those things, more so even than exercise, the data will show. So I really wanted to take a look at sleep, and that meant I had to start tracking my sleep habits. And just by doing that, it affected, positive behavior change for me. And I've definitely seen some improvements that my fitness tracker helps me monitor and also reinforce. But with that in mind, we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about sleep, because so many of you have talked about sleep as being sort of a major factor in terms of your stress signs and symptoms and when things aren't going well, but also things you want to pay attention to when they are. So let's talk a little bit about sleep.
When we're talking about sleep and sleep hygiene, I like to think of routines. And we can look at kind of like your morning routine, because that's a pretty common like verbiage. It's like you have your morning routine. You wake up, you have your coffee, you brush your teeth, you have set things that you do, that it's pretty normal to have a morning routine. And oftentimes we do have a bedtime routine. But really thinking about it of like, are there things that you already do that are just kind of part of this informal routine, and assessing that and kind of taking that information, taking that assessment and that tracking, and identifying spaces for small shifts or changes to those habits, in a really intentional way to kind of promote sleep hygiene. And this will be different person to person. Like we will all have slightly different routines of what works for us. But there are some common areas we can look to. So when building out your routine or making those adjustments, we can look to avoid some things. So like screens in bed, caffeine in the afternoon, and alcohol right before bed. So thinking about like, okay, am I engaging in any of these? And if so, is it impacting your sleep? And kind of using that tracking information to kind of give you that assessment and that context. And then there's also things that we can add. So more sunlight during the day to help with circadian rhythm, and identifying those activities that you find calming in roughly the hour before bed. Again, it can vary person to person, and it really depends. For some people, that's having a cup of tea, it's having a bubble bath, it's chatting with your partner. It really varies. And then also really thinking about the space itself. And so we have this visual on the right, and if you're interested in more information on this, we do have resources and links embedded, but kind of identifying and seeing, is your sleep space clean, cool in temperature, dark, and quiet, which I recognize is not always feasible. If you are a caregiver, if you have pets, quiet is not always going to be attainable. But figuring out, okay, which of these do you have space to control or adjust? And then finally, if you're having difficulty falling asleep, a strategy and tip that I personally have found really helpful is getting out of bed, doing a calming activity. I read books, I read a chapter, and then I try to go to sleep again. So these are kind of some of those kind of small shifts and adjustments with the intent that you're not going to do everything, but sort of identifying through that self-assessment, what are you already doing, and what can you add to that space?
I appreciate the chat. A couple people talking about having their routines or understanding how valuable sleep is, particularly when you've gone through periods of your life where it's been more difficult to attain. And one of the other points here, Kayla, I just wanted to point out with the whole, if you can't fall asleep, get out of bed. That was a really hard one for me to start doing. But the idea being that what people who study sleep says is your bed really needs to be a place for sleep. So if you're not sleeping there, you're kind of training your body and your brain that it's a place to also fret or lie around and just not sleep. And so they're saying, get up, get out, walk into another room, even if it's just for a few minutes, maybe do some breathing exercises, just whatever makes it easier. And then go back so that bed becomes a place where you sleep. And I think the other thing that's challenging with this is most sleep experts would say if you have trouble sleeping, it's a really good idea not to have television Not to be watching television in bed, though that is a luxury a lot of people really enjoy, but it's just something to think about if you need to make that change. It's not prescriptive for everybody. It just depends on how your sleep is. And I also wanted to just reflect that when I said I'm going to start monitoring my sleep and I realized I wasn't doing great, I changed up everything in our bedroom. I was like, okay, that's it. I got rid of our mattress. I got a different, bigger, cooling hybrid mattress. I changed our shades, changed the kind of blanket that I used. I use a weighted blanket. Just all of these things as make it as cool and dark and quiet as I could. And it really made it, I hadn't realized just how even the limited amount of kind of light and noise and activity and just disruption that was occurring at night was really affecting my sleep. And not, shutting off electronics ahead of time. It's really important. I'm curious, because we do have a little time, Kayla, to see, for those of you who maybe work shift work, maybe some of you work shift work, or if you have in the past, any suggestions for that? Because sometimes shift work can also be make sleeping more of a challenge if you're working 12 hours on, 12 hours off for several days. I'm wondering if anybody has any strategies they've used. I actually did just buy a white noise machine recently as well, and I particularly like the ocean sound. That's really nice. But yeah, definitely in the chat, if any of you have any other suggestions that have worked for you when maybe conditions aren't ideal, just please definitely go ahead and share those. And yeah, a sleep, like, because sometimes when you're doing a sleep mask to make sure it's dark, and actually, particularly when I was doing shift work, making sure I sort of almost went into it was like going into a cave, earplugs, eye cover, all of that absolutely is important for the shift work. And I like the guided meditations too. I'll do that sometimes before bed. Like, there's several apps that have them. For those of you who do use something like Peloton, they have them, but also apps like Calm and 10% Happier is a meditation app that also has a lot of bedtime. And then, blackout curtains. I think the big thing is that silent dark, quiet dark is really important. And I also think with shift work, in my experience at least, just making sure you have a routine, right? So you get off shift and you go home and you have a set routine on those nights or days when you're working shifts, so that you've trained your body. This is when we shut down. This is when we relax. This is when we calm down. And listening to books on tape, that can be very relaxing as well. One of my first, I know I'm getting ready for bed when I take my dogs out and walk them around the block. That is my signal that it's time for me to start winding down. It's a moving meditation, so to speak. Plus I get to take care of the critters while I'm at it. Kayla, anything else you wanted to add on this? A lot of good suggestions for sleep.
These are fantastic suggestions. I would just add that, like, when we're pulling it back and thinking about this in the context of emotional intelligence, this pulls in not just the self-awareness of what are we doing and kind of assessing that information, but that self-management piece as well, and kind of that those changes and those adjustments that we make.
Yeah, and I think too, something that for me, I'm a cook. I love cooking. I cook all the time. Part of that too is sort of picking the right wine to go with the meal, and particularly during the pandemic, we definitely would have wine with dinner most nights or several nights. And then when I started tracking things, I realized, hey, actually, even though that wine with dinner tastes really good with what I made, it is actually impacting my sleep, even if it's just a glass or so, because that, the sugar response that happens, that stimulation response that happens a few hours later tends to happen kind of when you're in bed and asleep. So, but just being aware of what was it that was happening for me in those hours between 3 p.m. and 9:30, that maybe we're contributing to ineffective sleep. So just another thing to think about. The first is start with tracking, and then look at what do you really want to improve, and then maybe start adding in or taking things out of your routine to see if that makes a difference. Because as somebody said, look, when I sleep well, I exercise more, I have more energy, I think better. I know personally I'm more fun to live with. So, and congrats for folks who've decided that the pandemic alcohol coping strategy maybe didn't work for them. And I have several friends who've come to that conclusion as well, and are finding that lifestyle is healthier now, that we're not just working from home and engaging in a little bit of liquid relaxation on a regular basis. But if that's right for you. So, all right, great. I think that's good. Anything else on sleep for you, Kayla?
No, I think we covered everything. I'm probably going to backtrack in the chat to take more notes.
Good.
But I think we're good to move on.
So let's talk about a different kind of strategy. So how many people have been to presentations and heard a lot about work-life balance, right? Put a Y or an N in the chat. Is this a topic that comes up a lot? Is it important? Yeah, right? Work-life balance. So does it make sense, though, that I'm going to change the topic to work-life juggling? It's the concept of balance, this sort of image I get of sort of a teeter-totter or a scale where everything's even. You know, I've been alive long enough to know that at no point in my life has everything been balanced, right? So if I'm trying to achieve that, I'm probably destined to not succeed at that if that's what I'm looking for. What I really want to do is figure out a way to effectively kind of juggle, right? Keep things in the air, don't drop the balls. I also think I'd like to think of juggling as fun, not like frenetic, right? It's fun. I want this to be kind of fun. So when I'm talking about work-life balance or juggling, I'm really talking about how do we approach our personal time versus our work time, kind of our obligations. How do we prioritize those things? How much energy goes to those things? And recognizing that it's not sort of an end state to get to. Like, oh, I've achieved work-life balance. It's depending, as I think everybody can agree, that everybody knows that at different times of your life, you have different challenges and stressors in those different areas of your life that may require more energy and time. There can be a family health crisis. There can be childcare needs. There can be a new job. There can be some financial challenges or endeavors that require quite a bit of attention. So it's just that the idea is, how do you understand how to maximize and prioritize the way you want to, so that your energy is going to where it needs to go and you're not feeling overwhelmed and sort of buried, or like you're dropping all those balls, right? So that's what we're really looking at trying to think about. And I will say, I just want to point out that barriers, when we've talked across sectors to this, the biggest barrier to people saying, you know, they're feeling around achieving a sense of kind of reasonable work-life juggling, balance, etc. The biggest barrier is really a lack of role modeling. They don't see their managers, their supervisors, some of their peers. They don't see it. And so therefore they don't do it. And I feel like this is really important because it's kind of the number one thing that's going to help shift people personally and also organizationally, is if there's kind of a culture where we role model the priorities we want people to have, the behaviors that we want them to do. And sometimes we're the role model, right? So sort of taking a look at yourself first and saying, well, what do I role model? To the people that work with me, do I role model that I care about my personal time? I care about their personal time. Family is important to me. My physical health is important to me. Like what do I role model? And what do I see around me? And just because somebody is maybe above you in the food chain, so to speak, or in the command chain, doesn't role model it, I just challenge people to say, yeah, but does that mean that you can't? That you can't do a better job for yourself on managing those competing priorities. Some of it involves skill building. I mean, learning real-time time management, learning how to communicate what your needs and priorities are, so that people around you understand why you're behaving the way you're behaving. And also, I think we need to take a look at the culture that we work within. And I certainly have worked for a long time in a culture that glorifies burnout. We all like to brag about the vacation we never took and the hours that we worked beyond what we should have. And the last time, we did anything for ourselves. That's kind of a piece of the emergency response culture that is really starting to shift as we've recognized that we are actually losing people because of that. We're losing them because of their physiological health. We're losing them because of their psychological health. And then we're just losing them because they're just tired of it. They're just done. So I think looking at those barriers as saying, you know what, I don't like those barriers. I would rather really think about how do we do a better job of kind of prioritizing and understanding where our energy is going and where we want it to go so we can make some changes. So again, this is part of this self-awareness piece, but it's also part of the self-management piece. Next slide. So what I'm going to ask you all to do is take your piece of paper and your pencil, and I want you to draw a circle, just like the one on the left. Just draw a big old circle. And, this is an activity and an exercise I've been doing for years for myself and for my team, for a lot of folks that I've worked with. And it's sort of like, let's take a look at your life pie. If you thought about your life as a pie, right? A pie is a, it's a definitive circle, right? That we cut into slices. And let's say each of those slices of a pie of your life represents some component of life, some sort of umbrella component. We've listed some here, work and career, professional, financial, physical, or your health. That could also be physical activity, social, family, personal growth, and spiritual, sort of elements of your life where you put energy, time, and effort. And if one of these or these don't all resonate with you, maybe, I don't know, something like beekeeping is a big part of your your life component, or, working with children or community engagement, whatever works for you. But what are the components of your life? And then if you were going to, within that circle you just drew, cut up that pie to represent actual time and energy you spend in each of those components, the first thing I would say is I guarantee it's not going to look like the image on the left, right? Because we don't devote equal time and energy to each component of our life. It depends. So next slide. So if I were going to divide mine up, it might look like this right now. And I'd ask you all to just take a minute and really think about it. Like, if you thought about the components of your life, what do those slices look like? And just, really quickly, not giving it too much thought. Don't think on it too hard. Just where is your energy and time going? What do you have to, or are you prioritizing right now for whatever reason? And then I want you to just take a look at that pie for a second. And the first thing I'd want you to know is there's no such thing as a good or a bad pie, right? Don't judge your pie. It is what it is, right? And it's not good, it's not bad. It just is what your pie looks like right now. And the other thing to realize is that if you were sitting next to somebody who was also doing this exercise, that your pie is not going to look like their pie, right? Their pie is maybe going to look a little different. So if you're looking at this as my pie, the question I'm asking myself is not, is this a good or bad pie? It is, am I happy with this pie? Is this kind of what I want it to look like? And that's the first question. Or is it sort of the way it needs to be right now? If happy isn't the right kind of descriptor, then this is kind of what the pie needs to look like right now, just given what's going on. So that's the first thing I would ask. And if the answer to that is, wow, look at how much time sort of my work life takes versus like my family life right now. Now, we've been in the middle of a challenging time. In my sector of work, which is emergency response and public health response, it remains challenging. But that said, we've been doing this for a while. So my next question might be, hey, I do want to put some more time into my family. I haven't been able to in the last year or so the way I'd like to. And the thing I would say is that when you're looking at changing one of those slices of pie, if you're going to make a piece bigger, you're going to have to do what? Make one of those other pieces smaller. So it is, it is important to understand, like, where could I or should I or would I take from? So it's just a way of kind of visually putting on paper right in front of you, where's your time and energy going? And I do want to reflect, as in the chat, there are times in our life, if we have, health issues or personal issues going on, where one of those slices or two of those slices might be really big because they have to be. Or there's no choice for that at this exact moment. But the thought is, if I were going to increase another slice, where could I take that from? What one thing might I do, maybe to make that family pie a little bigger? And maybe for me, it's, you know what, I'm gonna drive up to New Jersey to see my brother and his family next month. I haven't seen them for several months. So that's going to make that piece of slice of pie a little bigger. And to do that, it means I'm probably gonna have to take a little bit of time off work. So that's where I'm gonna make that shift. But it doesn't have to be overly simplistic. But the idea here is, you do this one time. I recommend people do this about every 30 days or so, because it's not just about what does your pie look like right now. It's that after you've assessed it and sort of asked, hey, what changes might I want to make? What might I want to do? When you look at it in 30 days, does that pie reflect that sort of intention or desire that you put out there, even if it's just a small amount? And again, this goes back to tracking, right? It's a way to sort of say, hey, I really have made some of those changes that I wanted to make. And this one slice is a little bit smaller because I've been able to increase this other slice I really wanted to increase. Or maybe it's just the entire pie is a little more balanced, and that's really what I wanted. It was just to feel a little more like energy was going in different directions in more of an equitable way than it is right now. So this is just another activity strategy you can use. You can do this. I do it in my planner, sort of at the end of the month. I do my little circle and I do my slices and figure it out. And quite frankly, I'm okay with this pie right now. I think probably in the next year, I'd like to see a little less in the career piece and maybe a little more in the personal growth, where I can maybe do some things to enhance my skill set or my knowledge base on some stuff that I just haven't had time to keep up with. That's kind of where I'd like to go, which I think will enhance my career too. So that's where I'm at with this. But I hope maybe you've been able to think about, okay, am I happy with this pie? What changes might I make? Kayla, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I would just add here, so in the previous slide, we've actually linked, let me see if I can get to it. There it is. I've linked compiled resilience tips. So if you're looking to do this activity again, or you think this would be helpful in your personal or professional space, one of the tips in this resource kind of walks you through this activity as well. So that way, if you're like a month down the road and you're like, okay, there was an activity that I'm pretty sure I meant to do. What was that? You can look back at this, and there's a resource. I mean, it's outlined here in the slides, but there's kind of a walkthrough through the link as well. Thanks, Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we also wanted to kind of tie in and unpack boundaries as well, both regulation as well as maintenance. So I know at the beginning we kind of asked like where your workspace is, if it's virtual, in person, hybrid. So kind of with this space, it's really about thinking, has your workspace or your personal space changed at all? And really thinking about the boundaries within that pie and what that says to the people around you, that role modeling piece that Rachel mentioned earlier, as well as the norms. And this really ties to the maintenance component here of like, okay, if you're engaging in healthy boundaries, maybe you feel like you're on top of it. Is that still the case? And kind of recognizing when norms and culture shift, whether it's in your professional space or your personal space. I know sometimes, especially in emergency management and disaster work, we'll go through kind of heightened times where our level of engagement will increase substantially. So the boundaries may shift. So our level of engagement and the level of energy and bandwidth may kind of adjust based on current activities. But then also kind of thinking, okay, is this sustainable? Going back to that life pie, and is this kind of going back when we aren't in that heightened state or acute response? And then we have a couple tips of kind of how you can integrate this. So like, okay, we have regulation, we have boundaries, maintenance of like, okay, how do you keep this up and recognize when boundaries may be slipping? But how do you actually do that? And a couple key tips that we've been hearing a lot as really working in a variety of workforce sectors is having those routines during those transition phases between those different kind of pie slices or personal time and work, as well as really taking time off and having that leisure time, that time to take a break, take a breath, and kind of rewind and wind down. And then when there are kind of those heightened activities where there's heightened stress, engaging in stop. And I'm curious, is this a strategy you've heard about before? Yes or no in the chat.
The stop strategy. Okay.
Okay, so
Yes,
this is new for,
yep.
yeah, this is new for a lot of folks. That's very exciting. So stop, we did hyperlink a resource if you want to learn more, but simply put, it's kind of like a go-to strategy of, okay, if you're experiencing heightened distress, if you're recognizing, okay, I'm kind of in this heightened state, stop, take a pause, take a few breaths, observe the situation, and then proceed. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Yeah, it's about it's about understanding when you're becoming reactive. So a lot of us will notice that when, like, I'll start talking faster, right? I'll be in a conversation or an interaction and I'll start talking faster. And then I realize, because I'm breathing faster, which means our heart rate's a little elevated because I'm in the middle of something that's either overwhelming or potentially a conflict. And the stop is like, just stop for a second. And it's taking those few deep breaths. And by that, I usually mean 4. I do 4 with an with a count. Inhale 4, hold it 4, exhale 4. And I do 4 rounds of that. And then really observe not just what's happening external to you, but what's happening inside of you. Be able to calm down, able to think a little clearer, and then proceed. So it's just sort of, it's a strategy from your head. If you can say, oh, I'm getting agitated, or I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm feeling pushed, to say, you know what, just stop and take that as just sort of a second. And it is a piece of boundaries as well. I think we tend to be pretty reactive, particularly those of us, which many of us, given the fact that you're on the webinar, are in professions where being responsive and being reactive are often the same thing, right? We're trying to react quickly so that we are responsive to things. But in reality, we do need to kind of take a step and stop for a second to make sure that what we're doing next is something that's regulating both our stress responses as well as the situation in general. One of the examples, Kayla, you and I were talking about earlier today on this as well, this kind of boundary regulation, is a colleague of ours who, because of the pandemic, they are remote all the time, and they have teammates who call sort of at any time of day, like 7 in the morning or later at night, because sort of that time frame between when does the workday start and end has gotten so blurry for people. And they're even in different time zones, and they're not really taking that into account either. I think, as Kayla said, we've shifted some boundaries depending on our circumstance, but maybe it's time for us to take a look at where those are. And is it time to start putting some regulation in place and saying, you know what, I'm happy to respond to an email or a phone call at X time. But before that, unless literally it's an emergency, I prefer not to be reached out to at that point, and I'm certainly not going to respond to a 7 a.m. phone call that's of a non-emergent nature. So, it's just setting up different expectations. But I think the challenge is we want to be responsive. We want people to know that we're here to help. So, anything else with that, Kayla?
I just want to reflect. Earlier in the chat, someone mentioned that piece about it's okay to say no as well, and kind of figuring out those spaces for when is it appropriate to take a moment before immediately saying yes, and kind of assessing what is on your plate. And that can be, that can be professionally, but it could also be personal as well. So, yeah,
I'm now famous for saying I need to think about that for a minute. And by a minute, I mean like 10 minutes. But when somebody asks me, do you want to do this, or should we do that, or can you do X? My new go-to answer is I need to think about that for a minute. And so I can just kind of step away, because otherwise I find myself overextended, overengaged, and over-promising, quite frankly. Thanks, Kayla.
Mm-hmm. All right, so now we're going to kind of shift into that self-motivation space of revisiting values as well as purpose. And one of the ways that we've been framing this is kind of looking at purpose in the different spaces and the different domains. So the purpose that you draw from the work that you do, the purpose within your organization, and purpose outside of work. And what we know is that when those align, those positively impact that overall sense of commitment, of well-being, and sense of meaning in the work that you do, as well as just all of these spaces. But one of the kind of issues that can come up is when there's a misalignment. So when one of these or all of them are disjointed, and what that can mean in terms of that individual sense of value and purpose in your professional and personal space. So for example, if maybe when maybe your current work kind of shifts and your roles and responsibilities no longer kind of align with your personal values and outside of work, and there's kind of that misalignment, that gap of, okay, here is this gap, here's this misalignment, how do we switch it back to a more cohesive Venn diagram in this case, of kind of pulling those together and finding those synergies of individual and professional values and purpose. So I'm going to ask that you take out your pen or writing utensil and paper again, and I'm going to ask you a couple questions. I'm going to, if you can write down. So when we're thinking about kind of revisiting values, rekindling drive, there's some guiding questions we can look to kind of identify spaces of really identifying what are your personal values. What about your work incorporates those personal values? And then really kind of simply who gives you energy, or what projects or activities. I'm going to ask that you write those down on a piece of paper and give a couple minutes. But I'm curious, Rachel, what are your personal values?
I think about this a lot, and the work that we do. And I think a big piece to me is I really do consider service and work and a lifestyle that lends itself to service of others is a kind of centering value for me. And when I feel that is not being achieved, or is somehow not in alignment with what I'm being asked to do, I definitely feel distressed by that. I want to feel like I'm of service. I want to feel like the work I do has some meaning. And it, it helps working in sort of a disaster response context because the mission is so good, right? But sometimes what we have to do, or the decisions we make, or the people that we're not able to help, for circumstances outside of our control, can make that feel misaligned. So I sort of have to go back to kind of what's making me show up every day. How does the work I do and how do the activities I do outside of work support those? Taking a look at that on a regular basis, having conversations about that with colleagues or friends can be a very powerful way of just, again, redirecting kind of where your intentions go. So I really recommend you definitely put this stuff down in writing for yourself. You don't have to share it with anybody necessarily, but really kind of reflecting on kind of what internally drives you and putting that down on paper is another good way to harness that motivation and build on it. Kayla?
Thanks, Rachel. I think we are good, and in terms of time, I think we can move on. But yes, I agree. Just having these questions at the ready and kind of thinking through, and especially like what or who gives you energy, and identifying those passions, and seeing how you can incorporate that. I know I have some go-to people both in my professional and personal life that I reach to on a regular basis because they do give me energy. They do kind of help me when I may be feeling kind of run down or just stressed or overwhelmed. Like they're my go-to people. So knowing who those are and really tying it back to, okay, this, along with identifying those values and how those all tie together, is a really, really important tool. But thanks, Rachel.
Kayla, I want to just reflect on a comment in the chat about sort of when you pause or hesitate to answer a question, which I appreciate that comment. I think the idea by taking a pause is kind of how you convey it or how you communicate that. I think if I say to somebody, that's a really important question, or I really need to think about that for a second because I want to give you a thoughtful answer, so that people understand what does that silence mean? What's the meaning of the silence? And it's not necessarily silence means dissent or anything. It's really more of I need to reflect on that for a minute so I can give you the thoughtful answer that question or that request deserves. Can mitigate some of that discomfort that I think you quite rightly pointed out there in the chat. Thanks for that. So we're gonna shift to another concept. I want you to give me a little leeway here. A year ago, one of the concepts that really helped me when I was struggling, that I then was sharing with others, was this concept of an optimistic mindset. How do you build an optimistic mindset, particularly when optimism is hard to do? And if you haven't seen that presentation, I recommend you go back and just kind of take a look at that, because that skill on how to be optimistic when it's hard to do is a very interesting approach. I was finding that, and I still find that meaningful and of help, but I stumbled across a different skill and way of being that I hadn't really thought about before, that became pretty powerful, which is the skill and sort of living with the intention of practicing forgiveness. And by forgiveness, I don't mean just turning the other cheek and ignoring, wrongs or harms or whatever. I mean intentionally and really working on forgiveness as sort of a way in which you approach things. And before I start kind of by what I found really resonated with me in looking at this material, I'm just wondering if you would mind putting into the chat, when I say forgiveness, like how do you conceive of forgiveness? Like how would you define forgiveness? You just use a word or two. You don't have to write sort of a Webster's dictionary definition, but what does forgiveness mean? When you look at that word, like what does it bring up for you? Letting go, putting it in the past, freedom, a lot of letting go, acceptance, peace, recognizing the humanity of actions, right? There's no right or wrong, by the way. I'm saying these are all right. Empathy, moving forward, grace, a lot of tolerance, really powerful words, right? If you're thinking in terms of how you want to be, even at times of adversity, or specifically at times of adversity, this idea of how does forgiveness come into play here? And I have found this to be really helpful to reflect on. And to try and apply myself to having more forgiveness in my life, allowing yourself and others to be human, letting go. And I really appreciate folks who've already put like the self in here, because I think that's a big piece of it. Next slide, Kayla. So the definition I'm going off of incorporates a lot of what you guys have already said. It's not a right or wrong. It's just kind of the one I found that this release of negative other directed emotions that resulted from harm caused by prior actions of another or of the self, right? And that release of these negative emotions may or may not be replaced by positive other directed emotions. It can go either way, right? The interesting thing is both are extremely valid and beneficial. So if you frame it with benevolent versus non-benevolent, what I mean by that is those negative emotions that resulted from some sort of harm, maybe something you did or didn't do yourself, something that was done to you, or something that someone else did that caused harm to you. Those emotions, that hurt, that anger, that disappointment, maybe even that sense of betrayal is let go and replaced with more positive emotions, more maybe more understanding of the self or the other, maybe more flexibility in sort of how we assess those person's actions and motivations, et cetera. So it's replaced by this benevolent, these positive emotions. Now, sometimes we practice forgiveness and that doesn't happen. I mean, it's okay. If you say, you know what, I don't feel better about this, but I'm not willing to hold on to this anymore. Whatever these emotions and this sort of sense of being hurt or betrayed, or the poison that the anger or whatever that negative emotion is worse for me than leaving it here and walking away with it, walking away from it. I'm not doing that. And the reason I bring up both of these is because the studies have shown, next slide, Kayla, that at the bottom that there are absolute measurable health benefits and from either form of forgiveness, benevolent or not. But the idea of letting go of those negative emotions, putting those down, walking away, maybe even sort of replacing those with some positive, forceful, change for good, kinds of emotions, maybe not. But there's absolute positive health benefits to it. So then the question is, what if it's hard? What if it's really hard to be forgiving right now? I'm just not feeling it. So there's actual things you can do. There's sort of a way of approaching it when you feel wronged or hurt or angry or frustrated. It's an active process. And the first thing is to sort of reflect on the experience. Like, what is it about the situation or the circumstance or whatever happened that created the emotions? If possible, can one feel empathy to the person who maybe is the cause of these circumstances, which could even be the self, right? Can one feel some empathy, sort of try and understand this person was doing something for some reason that had some functionality, even if it was ended up being harmful or not giving or charitable. And then readjusting expectations, sort of that doing the best you could given with what you had at the time. And then incorporating that self-forgiveness, no matter what, even if it's more of a transactional forgiveness with someone else, understanding one's own role or one's own part in it, with the willingness to forgive yourself for that. If you are talking about forgiving another person, having a conversation about it could be helpful. If that doesn't feel like something one wants to do or could do or should do, you can always have alternative methods of communication. Many people write letters. to people that they feel they need to forgive for past harms. Not even expecting an answer necessarily to that letter, but the act of reaching out with a letter of forgiveness is helpful. And then there are some circumstances where that's not possible. The person may not be in a situation where you can have an interaction, or maybe you don't want to, but you do want to have that act of forgiveness, those actions that help you let those emotions, let them go. In which case, just writing out the circumstances and sort of going through those steps of reflection, trying to engage in some empathy, readjusting the expectations or your assessment of the situation, and then maybe even just highlighting why it's important to be willing to put this burden down. These are very powerful activities you can do that can enhance your ability to kind of use this muscle, so to speak, of forgiveness. And it's certainly something, it's not easy, but it's certainly been something I've been practicing, because there's been a lot of circumstances in the last year or two that have been pretty disappointing. And just trying to understand the context people have been in, the context I've been in, and really willing to lay down those negative emotions, the guilt, the anger, has been a pretty powerful thing. So we gave you a couple of articles for you to link to if you want to think more about this, if it's not sort of a natural orientation for you, or if it's something you just hadn't really thought about. How does forgiveness show up in your life, and where has it helped? So I encourage you to take a look at that. And before we move on, Kayla, anything else?
I tried to unmute myself with the space bar, and that did not work. Now, I would just add here that if you're kind of going the route of writing out or doing kind of a self processing, it doesn't have to be written down. Personally, I'm not a journaler. That's something that is not really my jam, but I really enjoy self-talk. So this can also be verbal. Like, there are different ways that you can kind of dive into this based on what works for you. Thanks, Rachel.
Yep. So I think here, and Kayla, I want to just briefly go through this, because I do want to leave a few minutes for questions. But in summary, we just sort of want to say, look, we've given you some kind of out of the ordinary strategies that we hadn't really been promoting in the past, that we found helpful for others. But we also want to reflect on the fact that we all have certain limitations right now. Some of these practices or approaches may be easy to incorporate, or maybe appealing, and some may seem a little difficult at this point. And that's okay, because part of the whole point was that self-awareness first, like kind of what's going on, where are you now, and where can you go from there? So sometimes it's not going to be enough. These strategies, these ideas, or you kind of want to do it, but you just can't get over the line of I'm having a hard time implementing this stuff. In which case we sort of want to think about, so when would you pull in some extra support, and where might that come from? Kayla?
So there are different spaces we can look to for pulling in support. And when we're thinking about additional supports, we kind of came up with a checklist, and if you decide that you want to print out these slides, you can check off the ones that like you kind of have in your toolbox. But kind of looking beyond, maybe if you have an employee assistance program or kind of clinical support, what all do you have when it comes to additional supports? And these can come from a myriad of spaces. This can be friends, family, loved ones. It can be your general practitioner or a doctor. It can be if you're part of a really kind of healthy and engaging social media group. There are a lot of different spaces that can provide additional support in different ways. And if I'm looking at the image, and I do think it's important to remember that this will vary from person to person. So what works for someone else may not be the right fit for you, but figuring out like, okay, which of these are kind of in your toolbox And are there additional or other supports that you would put on this list? But I do want to recognize time and give space for questions. So I'm going to move on to the last slide. Rachel?
Well, and finally, I think it's important that we usually end with a slide like this. Just, hey, sometimes things are just, the overwhelming is too much. We know that from the earlier slides that people are experiencing higher levels of distress and diagnosable symptoms. So just know, whether it's you or someone you are working with or someone you live with, these kinds of symptoms definitely would indicate a need to reach out for some higher degree of professional help. I wanted to highlight, for those of you who may not be aware, that the Suicide Prevention Lifeline is rolling out their 988 initiative. It's already available in many jurisdictions, but by July 16th, it should be national, to make it easier for folks who do feel like they're in crisis, or if you're worried about someone, you yourself can call 988 and get some support, some guidance, some assistance on managing a mental health crisis. As always, we want to point out the disaster distress helpline for when it doesn't reach that kind of a level, but you want someone to talk to that's trained, available 24/7, 365. You can always call the disaster distress helpline related to stress, particularly with the pandemic and other situations, and they can help refer you to resources and folks as well. So I'm going to end there. And Carla, I know we went almost to the end, but we'll see if there's any questions. If there are any questions, you can certainly type those into the chat. The other thing I'll let you know is Kayla and I are available via email to talk to anybody offline or as a sidebar if there's additional information or something we can help with. But Carla, given that, I'm going to go back on video here.
Great. We'll give it a minute or two for people to have a chance to submit questions, and then I'll have to do a brief concluding remarks. I did have a question while we're waiting for others to come in. Wait, I'll start my video as well. What advice would you give if someone is trying to enforce boundaries themselves, but that is not being respected by the people they work with?
So one, I would take a look again at some of the information we put, I think it was in the second webinar we did last time, on assertive communication, and really understanding sort of how you frame expressing what the needs are, as well as your response to those needs. Often people aren't receptive about boundaries because they feel like they're being given sort of definitive statements, right? As opposed to a problem solving approach to it, saying, here's a boundary I'd really like. I really need to be able to go home and pick up my kid or whatever it is. And I need this. I know you sometimes need meetings to run later. How do we work this out? What's a way that I can provide you with what you need and still get my needs met? So assertive communication is what I would look at. Because I think that is usually the problem. I think if you are able to express what your needs are in a problem-solving way, people are more open to problem-solving with you. And is that helpful, Carla?
Yes, I will revisit the earlier webinar. I definitely need that refresher myself.
So, and just on the question on, when somebody in your life or who you love needs counseling and they agree to it, but they don't do anything. This is a tricky one because at the end of the day, if somebody is not at risk of harming themselves or others directly, there is a degree to which they have to walk through that door. I'd suggest making that door as easy as possible to walk through. Maybe just starting with the disaster distress helpline, which doesn't require a great deal of commitment. It can be anonymous. It can just be, hey, just see how this feels, talking to someone a little bit about what's happening. And then if you are concerned at the degree of anybody, again, I always tell people, we think about the Suicide Prevention Lifeline as being for people in crisis. It's for people who are worried about people in crisis too. They can really help you walk through things when you feel like this is actually going beyond just, it would be nice if so-and-so talked to somebody. I'm worried about this person. And they can help you kind of how do you assess that? And what could you do? So those are the suggestions I would have at this point.
And for the disaster distress helpline, there's also text capability. So depending on a comfort level, that's also an avenue that may be an easier first step.
Yeah, great points. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I will wrap things up right on time. Amazing, such professionals. So thank you so much, Rachel Call and Kayla CV, for yet another thoughtful and, in my opinion, genuinely helpful training with some really creative ideas. And then on behalf of my partners and the co-sponsors of this event, Tom Henry at Department of Health and Steve Moskowitz of Office of Mental Health, we want to send many thanks to all of you in the audience for everything that you've been doing to just serve our community and keep us functioning during our very challenging recent past and not so recent past. It's longer and longer. But we really hope this webcast has given you some new ideas for how to keep yourself and your organization going as we continue to figure out how to work in a healthy manner throughout whatever challenges still remain in front of us. So thanks again, Rachel and Kayla. We hope everyone in the audience will join us again next week, June 30th at 1 o'clock for the companion webcast to this one, which is Building an Organizational Culture of Resilience, Lessons from the Field. So you can sign up for that in the Learning Management System, and we really hope to see you then. And once again, we appreciate everyone who joined us today. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time.